Thank you for that generous introduction. It's a huge privilege and honour to be invited by the Centre for Islam in the UK, and particularly Cardiff University. I know the place well since 5 to 6 years ago maybe, having done some work here, and also at the University of South Wales. So I know the area very well, and it's always nice to be invited back, albeit it's changed a lot, and the nice new buildings that you've got as well. And the important research that you're doing here it's really a testament to the work Professor Sophie Regular has done, and others in the department. Okay, so when I got the brief, it was very much to talk about some of your research around Islamophobic hate crimes. And for me, one of the most, I don't know if the word controversial is the right word, but one of the most interesting topics I was involved in recently was an ethnographic study around Islamophobia. Now, when I sort of embarked on this, and I'll talk about it in more detail, this narrative or idea was that academic writing sometimes can be quite sterile, and dare I say, boring. And so the idea was, well, how do you challenge those misconceptions? How do you bring about new research that changes people's minds in terms of Islamophobia? So that's the starting point, and I'll explain how I got to that position. But I think most of you will probably be aware of the Darren Osborne case recently, who of course murdered somebody using a van in Finsbury, outside Finsbury Mosque, while people were coming back to pray. And I think that case again has shone a light on how social media is used. I'm going to explore a bit about that, but also about the offline world and the merging of the two. So the things that he was looking at, this online pathway of radicalization, and then how he then goes out and says, look, I want to do what I want to do. I want to kill somebody. Now, by all recollection, the evidence now coming out of court was that he was watching documentaries, programs about the grooming scandal. And that's quite interesting because it picks up on some of the research I've been doing around trigger events, and how one incident can lead to a reprisal against anybody who's deemed to be of that vulnerable community. And so in Darren Osborne's case, it's a typical pathway of how he used that online space and then started communicating with people within the far right and those within that movement, the likes of Tommy Robinson, for example. I don't know if this is a claim to fame, but he has blocked me on Twitter.
Hey,
yes, I should move on quickly. So, me and my colleague, going back to this original study looking at ethnography, and I don't know if for those of you, I imagine you all know about ethnography, but it is about immersing yourself in the lives or the footsteps of those people you interview, those people you're researching about. So, me and my colleague, Dr. Irene Zempi, decided that we'd do a similar thing. So we spent a month where she dressed visibly as a Muslim, wearing the full niqab and burqa, the veil, and within public spaces in Leicester, she recorded her experiences. And I did the same. As you know, I'm not a visible Muslim, but the idea was, well, how long would it take me to grow a beard? Quite a long time, even longer or shorter to take it off. But could I dress visibly as a Muslim, and would my experiences be different in Birmingham? So the two of us said, let's see if there's merit to this. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, actually, could you call that a social experiment that you were involved with? I would argue that, for me anyway, at the time, I was doing this large research study with an organization who said, would you talk to Muslim women and men who had suffered online and offline abuse and tell us what you found? And I'll never forget, one of the people I spoke to said to me, Imran, you wouldn't really understand because you're not a visible Muslim. And I said, come again? He said, well, you wouldn't really understand the abuse I suffer as somebody who's practicing the beard, wears the hat and wears a jubba, the Islamic dress for men sometimes, because you just wouldn't get it unless you did it yourself. And so that was some of the rationale behind it, to say, well, okay, let's see if this actually is happening and what impact it has. I should say that study was also across news outlets like The Independent published a big piece on it, and there were some other media channels that did the same. So the title of today's talk was to say, well, actually, as researchers, potentially people in this room, how do you do dangerous ethnography, especially if it's around something like Islamophobia, and then also at the same time think that you can get the same results? What types of results are you getting? How can you use ethnography and autoethnography, which is what we primarily focused on? So for us, the idea was, could we use our personal experiences as primary data? And if so, could that primary data then inform understanding, especially the literature around hate crime and Islamophobia? And both of us actually spent a lot of time looking at this, saying, well, had anybody done this before? And we couldn't find too many examples of people that had done this, especially in terms of academics. Now, I always start off with the bad news before I go on to the good news. And some of you may remember this program, which was called My Week as a Muslim. Yeah, so without trying to get too politically correct on some of these things, this lady here, who was a non-Muslim, and I should say my colleague also, Dr. Irene Zempi, is a non-Muslim, so she's not a Muslim, but how many of you watched that program, just out of curiosity? Yeah. What do people think about it how did you find it?
It's a long time ago. I mean, she was ready to go back to her non-hijab wearing life, as far as I remember. It was slightly odd to make a sort of TV program around it. But I think that she learned something.
Okay.
I never watched the program. I remember reading an article on it, and there was a lot of controversy because of the fact that she browned herself up to look more of a Muslim, as well as wearing the hijab. But people were kind of questioning the ethicality of that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think that hits some of those points that I... So
not only that, they made her teeth brown as well.
I made a teeth brown, did it? Okay. Yeah. As you do, right? Yeah. And I think they made a nose bigger as well, I think, because obviously, Anyway. But the irony is, it was called My Week as a Muslim, and it got a lot of flack, a lot of criticism, because this idea that could you brown and make this lady more Muslim look alike if you did all these sort of changes to her appearance. Now, I should say for us, we had a similar invite. So at the time when we did our research study, I had a lot of radio channels and TV programs ask me, would you do it again? And we can record it and we'll make it, a social experiment, which seems to be the big phrase. And I said, well, actually, no, this is not why we did it. We did it to record experiences of Islamophobia, to try and understand our victims, because they suffer it 24/7. And that's not to say we did not believe that they were suffering this, but it was this idea that could we see their world through their eyes, and for a month. And the reason it was a month was literally the toll was too much. So my colleague, Dr. Irene Zempi's part of the project, she was sworn at, spat at, abused, and suffered quite a lot of trauma at the end of it. And I suffered similar results, not as bad as her, possibly due to her visible appearance. So this program actually shone a light, but maybe in a negative perception, sadly. Now, autoethnography as a research method, and this is why we employed it, we wanted to try and understand from the other side, how do you use personal stories? Can you actually narrate that in an academic journal article or an academic piece of work? So, whilst, and I'll show you photos at the end and you can judge whether my beard was actually a good one or not. The aim was for us to see if we could be insiders. So I'm a British Muslim myself. I would consider myself a British Muslim, but if I don't have the appearance, then am I treated differently? As that participant said to me, well, you don't really understand the impact on us because you haven't experienced it. Despite the fact that racial ethnicity can actually still be a trigger for the types of abuse that people who might look Muslim suffer. So this is the idea. We were trying to look at that victimization, but we were not trying to diminish what those victims had suffered. This idea was really more to see, well, actually, what is life like through those eyes. And as academic researchers, shouldn't we be pushing the boundaries when we look at things of this nature? So we explored this concept of autoethnography, and we tried to gain the insider knowledge that I think, sadly, in many cases, some academics or academic research has missed, unfortunately. Quite often when you talk about ethnography as well, people call it narcissistic, self-indulgent. You know, it's got that type of, sadly, taboo attached to it. But I do think if you can actually look at it through this concept of trying to understand a social phenomenon, what is the complexities around it? Can you use primary data from it and conclude something? And that's why when we were approached by a number of TV programs, say now let's go for BBC Asian Network and others, we declined on the basis that we didn't want to record it. It would diminish it. So we adopted this sense of the Muslim other, but within the public realm, within the public space. And it's interesting, when we did it as well, quite a lot of media outlets said to us, which areas? So which specific part of Birmingham did you suffer the abuse from? Because they were trying to get geography around it, and then, of course, create, I think, more mayhem around it. So we adopted this insider status based on my religion, but still an outsider, because I'm still trying to get into the community. And I'll never forget, I think, one of the things about ethnography and autoethnography, it is very reflexive. So it's about your own perception, your understanding. And I'll never forget going to the mosque, as I do to pray the Friday prayers, Jummah. And the Imam, when he saw me, he said, "Wow, you've seen the light." And I said, "Yes." So the moral dilemma I was posing was almost coming back home, and people around me that knew me very well were like, "Imran, what happened?" And it was a very tough decision. I think that's one of the things you have to grapple with as researchers. And we were, as I said, criticized by our participants because they said you couldn't understand the wider impacts that they had suffered. Now, when you look at autoethnography, we were trying to look at the two concepts of evocative and also analytical. So evocative, this emotional side. So we both kept a diary. It was very reflexive. We kept the stories that were produced, and we actually wanted to publish that in the academic paper, which I'll talk about. But we also wanted to develop this social, broader context of the phenomenon of Islamophobia. How does it impact you just because of your visible identity? Is that a trigger? And what we found, and I'll talk about this later, was that when I was a non-visible Muslim, I could get on with my day-to-day activities quite easily. When I changed my appearances, things became a lot more difficult. So there was a clear parallel understanding that we were actually suffering, both of us, through this period. And I'm a criminologist by nature, and I think, I don't know how many other criminologists are in the room, but criminologists quite often get criticized for having a lack of emotion. So quite hard, people that don't talk about their feelings, and people like Wakeman say criminologists just don't like to talk about themselves. And so for us, it also was trying to build this picture that actually we were not all these hardened individuals. We could connect with the wider world. What's interesting also is when we sent this paper, it was published in the journal Ethnography. Even the peer reviewers came back with quite interesting comments. So we had some very positive comments saying this was really innovative, rigorous, good piece of research. And then others that said, well, actually, you put your life at risk. And that's the other side of this, that both myself and Dr. Zempi quite clearly make in our work, that we're not encouraging people to just go and dress up and be a victim and then everything in the world will be a better place. No, that's not the idea. The idea is, can you use autoethnography? Can you do something around, in our research, around Islamophobia that hadn't been done previously, and does it give us any more context to understanding the self and the social context in which we were working in? But there were challenges. And I think you have to take these on board. There were a number of costs to both of us, emotionally, psychologically, mentally. Now, I never forget, when I did my research project for this large organization, we spoke to a number of Muslim women who said that they changed the locks on their doors because they had received threats online, and they thought that people were going to come offline and find where they lived. So they suffered emotionally in terms of anxiety. They suffered in terms of depression and taking pills. And quite interesting, Muslim men were much more hardened to talk about those experiences. So when I interviewed the Muslim men, they were like, it was fine, fine. And one person I spoke to said he was praying in a shed, which is where he worked. So he went to the garden, to the shed to pray, and that his workers had locked him in and then gone back in, and he had been stuck in the shed for about 4 or 5 hours, phoning the switchboard, but they wouldn't pick the phone up. And so eventually when he did come out, he was traumatized, as you can imagine. And he said that it was the first time I'm sharing this with anybody, but I stayed in the car park. I never went home until the next day. So it was a real, and I think generally in terms of Islamophobia, there's quite a lot of research, good research about Muslim women who've suffered Islamophobic hate crimes, but not much on Muslim men. There seems to be this idea that actually that's a different world altogether in some contexts. The other challenge that I think always comes about whenever you do ethnography and this type of research is the harm. And I think you have to be mindful of the environment in which you live in, the environment in which you're putting yourself into. Clearly there are problems around, or potential problems that might happen, and all researchers, we make very clear that that has to be taken into consideration, and you'd hope that those things would be done ethically and morally before you conducted that research. And as I noted before, the nature of ethnography is you can't really get consent in the traditional sense of a qualitative study where you got a consent form and you say X, Y, Z. So the question is, how do you grapple with that? How can you relay people's fears by saying, well, actually, this is important because of X, Y, and Z. And we did face a lot of difficulties trying to get people to agree to the concept, put it that way. It took several months to get them to say, well, actually, you know what, this is going to be of benefit. And as I said, we tried to avoid recordings just purely on that basis, that if we were doing that, we didn't want to make a mockery out of this or a TV documentary. That wasn't the aim. The aim was just to look at the participants through their eyes, the victimization that they suffer. And also, if we would have suffered it, maybe that might not have happened. What's interesting is that all the times that we suffered any sort of extra escalation of violence, it happened after a trigger event. So whether that was a case in Rotherham, whether it was a case of grooming, the fact that being shouted at and called a paedophile, being called a terrorist, then when you go back home and look at the news, there was just an attack done by ISIS at the time. So it was triggering emotions even more so when we were both out in public. But I do think that drawing on those experiences and using autoethnography, it's quite a novel way of doing it. It's not been done quite a lot in terms of Islamophobia. So we hope that the types of research and the information I'm sharing with you today is going to inspire people as well at the same time. So, well, actually, if I was to do this, here is a test, this is what happened, and that now, and equally you might say, well, actually, that's not for me. It's I'll leave you to it, Imran. So what happened to me in terms of actual findings? Now, you might say these are not uncommon things, but the fact I was sworn at, threats of physical violence, low-level stuff like general abuse that happened. So a van driver go past and shout, "You terrorist!" That was that sense. So when I was on a bus that I always caught when I was a non-visible Muslim, but then as soon as I was a visible Muslim, and as you can see, I carry my bag wherever it is, wherever I go. And so when I was carrying that, I probably made a big mistake when I caught the bus. and a group of young girls started swearing at the back and making gestures about terrorism. And when I approached them and said, well, what are you saying? They said, I go, are you talking about me? And I thought for a second, hang on, you're meant to be the researcher. Why are you getting angry? But it was like, I now understand when I speak to my participants, when they say sometimes, well, we reacted. I was like, why did you react? And until it happened to me, and I turned around and said, are you talking about me? And they said, no, we're not talking about you. I said, but you are. They said, we're not. And I said, what was interesting is when I went to the bus driver, nobody stood up in the bus. So there was about 7, 8 other people. Clearly some people had heard what had happened, being called a terrorist. And you start to question yourself, this reflexive exercise. You start looking, saying, hang on here, I'm the only Muslim on the bus, I think. I'm the only one with a beard. I'm the only one with a backpack. Maybe they are talking about me. But it does open questions about bystanders as well. Generally in hate crime, how much can bystanders intervene? And that's another question, For me, I didn't want any bystander to stand up and physically say, well, actually, I'm going to save the day. But for victims who we speak to, they suffer the same thing, and they always say, nobody stood up, nobody phoned the police, nobody did anything. It's just a normal day, everyday life. It's normalization of the type of abuse that they suffered. So these phrases, Muslim terrorist, filthy terrorist, suicide bomber, you lot are terrorists. And as I said, at the time I was conducting the research, there was quite a lot of ISIS beheadings that were happening at the time. So we could almost trigger this that said that maybe that was one of the causes for the types of abuse that in particular I had suffered. And I think this is also really a hard one, especially for me, because as I said, I kept a personal reflexive diary, and it was questions about embarrassment also, but also, well, actually, am I British in terms of the wider context? Well, I think I'm part of a part of Britain, but you start to question your identity, and you start to say, well, actually, maybe I'm not. Maybe I am being viewed as somebody who's from a different country or so forth. You start to ask yourself why. That really important question. Why is it happening to me? Why did I do this? Why did I react in this way? And it was same this idea about suspicion. So I go into a shop, under normal circumstances, buy my groceries and do the shopping. But suddenly, when I'm going into the shop, and people are looking at me differently, and it's a really hard one to sort of quantify, because again, when I spoke to my participants, they always said, Imran, it's when you get stared at, and I was like, okay, as a researcher, you're being stared at, fine, but until it happens to you, and some people might say, well, are you just paranoid? But then you could equally say, well, actually, when I'm at the till, why is it that the shopkeeper's not looking at me, he's looking the other way when he's asking me questions, or the security guard? So I was in a shop where I was circling around, as you do around the vegetables and the fruits, and the security guards just started following me, and I was like, you start thinking, have I picked up anything by mistake? And then he literally, as I turned around the corner, he said, can I have a quick word? And I was like, yeah, of course, yeah, fine. Turned around and he said, no, just checking, your bags that you got. Can I just have a quick look? I was like, why do you want to check my bags? And then I realized that, again, this sense of profiling was happening specifically because now I've been viewed in a different way. Because again, I've been to that shop quite a lot, never been questioned. That same security guard probably saw me and thought, this is a different person. I can't be dealing with the same person here. I also suffered the abuse being called the P word, the Paki terrorist. That was quite interesting, the way in which race interlinks with ethnicity, and also the way in which then you're still suffering from an Islamophobic crime. So religion and race are mixed, and that's why people like myself and others argue Islamophobia is a new form of racism. That until we can begin to create a definition around Islamophobia that includes race in it, it's a long way before we can actually tackle the attitudes and the problems associated with it. So racism and Islamophobia intertwined together to give you this mix, sadly, of the things that I experienced. And as I said, it was also this idea of name calling, but also the subtle ways of being derogatory to somebody. And it was almost like Imran, and this happened to me a couple of times, but somebody said to me once, Imran, I've heard your cousin or your brother, he's also doing similar work, and you were like, my cousin or my brother? I don't have a cousin or brother in this field. But because the name was Imran, that somehow we had to be related. Okay, and this was happening now more so because I was more visible as a Muslim. So is this the derogatory forms of humour and this type of sense of actually, it's okay to say this. And people like Baroness Said Awasi has said quite often that Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test in terms of it's normalised to that extent that people think they can get away with it, and that people will say it's fine, that's society. I actually say it's gone even further now than even the dinner table test. And ultimately, I was relieved when the ethnography was over. I was absolutely, I was thinking, but morally it was a tough one, because obviously when I went back to the mosque, the Imam wasn't very happy with me, and it was like, he was like, what were you up to? I was like, I wasn't up to anything. He was like, you must have been. That's it, I need to phone your mom. I was like, no, don't call her, please. Let's just keep it between you and me. But it made me question for Muslims who, again, 24/7 have to live with it. That's the reality. I always did it for 4 weeks, and I was relieved. My colleague, Dr. Irene Zempli, had the same experience. She was relieved. But my friends, interestingly, kept telling me and warning me, saying this was going to happen beforehand. That if visible Muslims are always targeted, and if you're not visible, you're less likely to be targeted, which might seem a straightforward thing, but until you experience it, it's hard to quantify. And there was this sense, as I said, of embarrassment, especially for a Muslim man to try and come out with your emotions and feelings. It was interesting when we sent the paper for review. One of the reviewers, and I don't know, some of you may be experienced publishers, but we had, I think, 4 peer reviews, and the editor was like, this is a great paper, but I don't know what to do, because one reviewer has said you put your life at risk, and then the others were like, this is really good, and the other one was like, I'm trying to work out why would a Muslim male be so open about their feelings and relate the story back. But emotionally we were bruised despite not physically being attacked. And I think that also brings back the social media context. So whilst our autoethnography was offline, I've done a lot of research around Islamophobia online. I've published quite a lot around the experiences. And trigger events do lead to counter-reactions like Woolwich, led to a spike in Islamophobic attacks online in terms of the abuse Muslims suffered. After the Paris attacks, the hashtag #KillAllMuslims was trending on social media. And so the types of abuse you suffer online, I think sometimes can also translate in terms of the offline, because people are quite easily susceptible to this echo chamber of things, which is what happened to Darren Osborne. So he gets emotive about all the language, the programs. He starts tweeting and getting messages from the far right, and then thinks one day it'd be a good idea to try and murder and reenact some of those feelings he was feeling in the online space. And also, I think you start to, as I said, ask questions about yourself. When I did my study talking to Muslim men and women, one of the interesting things was when I spoke to Muslim women, they kept telling me sometimes we take our hijab off, our headscarf off, when we go to the city centre. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, because we know that on a Saturday, we're more likely to get abused if we're wearing a headscarf. So I take it off because it's happened to me a couple of times, and I'm with my children, and they say, well, actually, Mummy, why are they swearing at you? So So she said, I take it off and then I come home and I put it back on. So it seemed, like people were changing their identities, or they were changing the way in which they travel. So some Muslim women actually said to us, I've changed the route, so I go a specific way to work, and I catch the other train just in case I get abused if I go that way. So there's quite this sense of change of behaviour. And similarly with Muslim men who said, look, I shaved my beard because I just couldn't deal with the types of abuse. But he said, I'm still a good Muslim. I still do the things, but I just visibly didn't want to be attacked. And I think that raises a lot of moral questions about religion and things that probably a lot of the people in the Islam Centre are working on at the moment. And should you just shave your beard or change your hijab because of that? I mean, what do people think? Do you agree with that, or can you understand the logic? Yeah.
It's not about understanding the logic. Like, I wear a hijab.
Yeah.
It's not obvious now. And when I was living in London, once a guy wanted to throw me down the underground because he thought that because I wear a hijab I'm a terrorist. Another time a guy with a bottle wanted to hit me in my face. And so it happened like a couple of times, and then I just got a bit scared, yes, but then it became a choice of, I know that the majority of the people are nice, but since there is the possibility that I will come across one crazy human being, maybe I just should take the safe way and dress in a way that does not necessarily say I'm a Muslim, but without showing my hair. And I took this approach, which doesn't necessarily make me happy. In the beginning, it made me very sad and very depressed, and I was crying all the time. And then it became just a way of life. And then I think what it really makes you question is not yourself, because you know that you're not doing anything wrong to society. You start to question why it is in society we are not asking ourselves the question of why we let one incident to become a reflection of all people. Like when I went to the Welsh National Assembly a couple of weeks ago, there was the guy who headed the security for the European Union, and when he spoke about radicalism, it was always equivalent to radical Islam. And I remember putting my hand up and saying, well, wait a minute, there are radical rights groups kind of winning elections throughout Europe now because maybe it's resulted from terrorist attacks, but when we talk about radicalism, there is radicalism in every ideology or religion. People can interpret what they want in the way they want. But in order to confront radicalism, whether it's ideological or religious, we need radical solutions that doesn't make everyone else look like they're a radical. And it's that balance between the government approach, the media approach, and potentially my approach. I think my approach is definitely the wrong approach, because if everyone else wore a hat, then they would have won. Those people who want to scare us would have won. So I'm happy when I walk around and see people still wearing their headscarf and not as scared. I just need to kind of stop being scared myself. That's sorry for talking.
No.
Thank you.
I was just going to say thank you for sharing your story. I appreciate that. Good job. Yeah.
I think I personally wouldn't change the way I look to conform to society's social norms or whatever. I don't think, why should I change what I wear just because something's happened? But at the same time, you've got to think, I don't want to put myself in a risky situation. So I work in what I wear, and this is how I dress. So if I don't get a job, Say at the end of the day, and I'm not being funny for that. People need to it's all about communication and perception. So I would never take off what I wear just to conform to society. But at the same time, I wouldn't risk myself. So when things have happened, incidents have happened, my mum said don't go out of the house because this person's been attacked, and don't go down that area because of this. But I just feel as though we've come to a day and age where people why should someone take off their hijab? It's absolutely shocking. No one should ever do that.
Yeah.
But it is what it is sometimes.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those stories. I think it's very powerful, both of those accounts, and I think it really does typify what I'm talking about today, really about identity, the self, and also the risk of victimization, the risk of hate crimes, and looking at yourself as an individual. But also, I think what we found was autoethnography is a difficult path. It's not for everybody. It can have its challenges. Some of those I've already mentioned. on the one hand, you are using this insider status, but are you really an insider when you change your appearance? That's another question that can be posed. And I also think, though, that there needs to be a balance as academics and as researchers. How far can you go? How far do you draw the line? Where's the balance? Where do you draw that balance? Sometimes it's a personal one. It's one that you can only picture, really. Other times you need other people to give you that advice and say, look, actually, you shouldn't be doing this, or you shouldn't be doing that, or vice versa. It's interesting. The EDL, for example, the English Defence League, they come to Birmingham quite often. And whenever they come, it's a similar reaction in terms of the Muslim community. So when you're in the mosque, the imam will say, try not to go on Saturday to the city centre because the EDL are there. And suddenly Facebook, you start getting all these messages, Twitter, and everybody's saying, well, actually, don't go out on Saturday because the EDL are there. So I think this self-conscious thing now as well. Sorry,
just on the back of that, sorry.
Yeah.
After an incident happened, I think whether it was Paris or Tunisia, but the Metropolitan Police was sending a message on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
They were like, anyone who's physically Muslim shouldn't go out. So things like that.
Yeah.
Quite shocking, just on the back of what
Yeah.
you said, like the imam.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could say it's shocking, but actually I watched a documentary where they showed that research did show that the second an incident happened, first you get stuff happening on the internet, people writing about it, and then within like 24 hours you get the first attack on the street. So there is a correlation. And that's what's worrying, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And depending on which research you look at, some say it's a 24, 48 hour spike, and then you get it online and then offline, it suddenly reacts, and people.
And may I just say something about EDL as
EDL,
well?
yeah.
So it's very weird because before I just lived in a multicultural area,
Yeah.
and then I moved to Tower Hamlet in London,
Okay.
where it's like they're called like it's almost like you're in Bangladesh. It's very cool.
Mhm.
But then suddenly I found myself every Friday.
Mm.
It was normal for EDL, a group of EDL, to attack the whole road and try to break into the mosque, and then people in the mosque going out to protect the people. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
It was a complete different experience of another area like Kensington
Yeah.
or Chelsea. So
Yeah.
again, if you're doing research, it would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
People are experiencing these things differently depending on where they live and the community they're in.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good point. And also, I think, coming back to that point, it also impacts on people's sense of this integration strategy that keeps being spoken about a lot. Why are they ghettoized areas of some communities? But some communities would say, I'm too afraid to move, either because they can't afford housing there, or because they might suffer hate and stuff. How much time have I got left?
You've got about another 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I'll start summing up. So, I think being a visible Muslim does deepen the empathy. For us, that was one of the key correlations of findings. Looking from the outside, but inside, if that makes sense. Seeing the context in which you're conducting the types of research that we were doing, and also accurately interpreting the stories and representing the voices. So what our participants have told us actually is a reflection of the things that we also experienced as well. So it's a confirmation, even though we always would listen and understand our participants' views. It's sort of almost an affirmation of that. I'm conscious of the time, but one of the things I just want to raise here very quickly is this idea of trauma and suffering because of this. And as I said, there were quite a number of times both myself and Dr. Irene Zempi had the same sort of feelings, but in a different context. Or we were staying up, waking up late, or various things that were happening on a personal level, even in our own homes, that we thought, well, actually, this has happened just after our sort of study looking at this visibility. And those questions about who am I, what am I? Somebody mentioned it, I think, here. You start questioning either yourself, but you do start to say, well, actually, is it something I've done? Why does that person not like me? Is it purely because of my appearance? So just to conclude, I'd say that we're not arguing one needs to turn themselves into a victim to be more understanding of a victim. So that's clearly not what we're trying to get at. Rather, we're trying to explore, and through empirical research, an unknown territory, and use autoethnography to understand Islamophobia, which for us hasn't been done previously, as far as we're aware. It does have an emotional labour attached to it, though. So that's the caveat, that It's not easy, and at the same time it's quite difficult. There are psychological impacts, there are physical impacts as well that you suffer from and that we suffered from on a personal level. Whether that was going to see a GP more than what we did previously might have been actually one of them. So what triggers Islamophobic responses? Ultimately, our research is saying is your visibility does. That your identity is the key factor that triggers quite a lot of the abuse or the high or low level types of abuse that you might suffer. If anybody is interested in looking at this in more detail, you can obviously read our paper, which I'll put up later. And I'm also publishing a book on this, a larger book this year in the summer, which again I'm happy to share with colleagues once that's out. And I'll just leave you with this Taber statement. Researchers must continually push boundaries, methodological boundaries, in order to address research questions. Sometimes we need to go beyond our comfort zone, depending on the type of research you're doing, obviously within the remit of what you're trying to understand. As promised, there is my mug shot there. There's another one of me in the middle. And that's the paper. So if you're interested in it, it's called Doing Dangerous Autoethnography on Islamophobic Victimization, and it's published in the journal Ethnography, which is published by Sage, and it will give you the whole story, the extracts, and so forth. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you so much.